Away. You believe in reasons.
Hi, I'm Michael Killen. Historians are increasingly bringing something extremely interesting to our awareness. It turns out that the wife of the second president of the United States developed some very important insights that I believe have an impact on us today. And I have invited an expert on Abigail Adams to come on this program and help share some insights and make us all aware of what that woman did and how her work has an impact on us today. My guest is Edie Gellis, and she is a professor from Stanford University and an important historian. Edie, how are you today?
I'm good, Michael. Thank you.
And you look great.
Thank you.
And I always love your exciting face. It's always full of life.
Well, that, Michael, is because we're swimmers. See, that makes all of the difference in the world. Once you get into the swimming pool, Michael, the problems of the world dissipate. Life is good.
How many books have you written related to Abigail Adams?
I've done 3. I did 2 biographies of Abigail on her own, and most recently I've written Abigail and John, which is a double biography of Abigail and John Adams.
Oh, so if I read those first 2 books, I don't need to read this one. You've covered all the insights, is that right?
But of course, Michael, but we all know that you never stop learning. And while I've actually been able to write a book which brings Abigail Adams into the forefront of history in my first 2 books, this one actually pays attention to John.
Really?
And this is a contribution to John's world.
But we all know books that have 2 focuses really never work. How did you get around that? And you will agree with me, it's difficult to write a book that has
double biography. Yes, I did have to give a lot of attention to how I was going to write a double biography. Of course, my earlier books about Abigail Adams did have John in her life. I couldn't have written about her without his being there. But in both of them, he was subordinated to her because I kept the focus on her. And this time I worked very hard to keep give attention, equal attention to both lives. And when I started thinking about it, I thought, okay, I'll do 1 chapter on her and 1 chapter on him. That's a sort of simple way of solving the problem, but it's really boring that way. And predictable. I didn't want to be predictable, of course. So then I thought, well, maybe what I would do is start 1 chapter paying attention to Abigail, and the 2nd chapter pay attention to John. And so that lasted 3 chapters. And by the 4th chapter, I couldn't do that anymore. So I finally just let go of the formula and let the material flow, and it worked that way because I knew both of them equally well, and I could let their stories merge and blend, and it's very interesting the way it happens. It's like putting together a puzzle. It's like a jigsaw puzzle, and when you start putting the pieces together, you find that out of this emerges something, out of this emerges a picture.
Would I be correct to say what has emerged is a focus, the marriage which is universal?
Right.
Not just for men and women now, but for people of the same sex. It's a universal concept.
Yeah. Well, pairing, certainly. Theirs was an unusual marriage, however, because they were married for 54 years, which is unusual probably in any age. It used to be unusual because people died and, men outlived 2 or 3 wives, and vice versa. Women would have 2 or 3 husbands. However the case worked out. But both of them lived long, and The amazing thing about their marriage is that John went off to lead the revolution after the first decade of their marriage. They were married in 1764, and in 1774, the events were escalating that led to revolution a year later. So in 1774, John went off to participate in the Continental Congress, and effectively for the next 10 years, they were apart most of the time. For 7 or 8 of those years, John was in Europe, and Abigail didn't even see him for that very long period of time. In fact, there was one period of a year when she didn't even receive letters from him. And finally, she ended up going to Europe and joining him in Europe because he wouldn't come home. He was waiting to become ambassador to England. They were called ministers at that time. He was waiting to become the first American minister to England. And what happened was she just decided she wanted to retain this marriage. She'd better go and live with him in Europe. And she did. And the marriage resumed with all of the interest and passion and compatibility that it had for the first decade. And that's amazing. It's something that is beyond our understanding today. Marriages just don't survive that long a hiatus, and theirs did. It's hard to explain.
May I make this point, and correct me though, but during this period when the two of them were far apart for many, many years, they wrote a lot to each other. And she wrote a lot.
Yes.
Right? And he was directly involved in a revolution, overthrowing the British government.
Right.
Would I be safe to say that she, in her writing, she started the process of another kind of revolution? And maybe from day one, none of us are ever at a particular point in the development of idea, but maybe over those ideas, her thinking kept evolving as she looked at one woman's issue after another. Would that be?
Well, that's interesting. I thought what you were going to say is that as she wrote these letters, what was evolving was, and what came into my mind was, what evolved was a history from a female perspective of the American Revolution. Abigail's letters all together, and there are hundreds of them surviving. No one knows how many of them there are. So I say hundreds, but it could be close to 1,000 or more. They constitute the American Revolution from a woman's perspective, and it's the only history that exists for any of us to read about the American Revolution, written by a contemporary of that event. So that was my take on it. Your take on it was that over that period evolved her consciousness of female subordination.
Yeah. And I guess a lot of people are interested in how the Revolution War developed, and from a woman's point of view, but for some odd reason, I find it fascinating to see how she touched on the need for different women's rights. I mean, to me, that's...
Right. And that was her experience. That's what she wrote about, Michael. She didn't write about the war. She wrote about woman's experience at war, what it was like to be at home while her loved one, her husband, was away leading the war, being a great statesman. And she suffered at home. She suffered from an epidemic, which ran through her household, killed her mother and a servant and all kinds of neighbors. She suffered from fear of the British attacking in her area. She was ready to evacuate her home because at one point it looked as if that would happen. She suffered from having to earn a livelihood because John was no longer supporting her. And she had to do this incredible thing, which was run a farm, which women didn't do. So that because of all of these experiences she had, which was women's experience in the war,